Great. So as I said, my name is Alicia. I'm the project manager for Shirley Heinze. We're really excited that you are joining us for the webinar tonight. We're very excited to have with us tonight speakers to talk about some unique local farmland preservation stories. I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Bill to start.
Okay. That come out okay? Okay. All right. Well, welcome everybody. I will be moving things around here so I can actually read what I've got on the screen. Just kind of an introduction to Shellburg Farm as of 2023. We were originally, the park was supposed to originally be the, I think it was within 30 days after the Park Service was established, we were supposed to be a national park, Indiana Sand Dunes National Park. A lot of people don't realize that. It was news to me when I found it out. The state park was a result of the first push. The first push was killed by the World War I, and then the state park was established after that. And then in the 50s, of course, the Save the Dunes folks got together with Paul Douglas and pushed very hard, worked very hard, got us the National Lakeshore in November of 1966. But in the late 60s, early 70s, it was decided to also make sure we get the Bailey Homestead, and kind of came with that the Shellburg Farm. So Shellburg Farm has been pretty much part of the landscape as long as I've been there, since 1984. So, but I figured I'd jump back way to the beginning, throw out a little bit of the glaciation story. So this is, when you're looking at the soils of all three of these sites, you're going to be talking about something that the parent material has a lot to do with glaciation, and then possibly some of the activities that happened after that. And of course, for a while, we had Lake Michigan on top of us and still on top of us with the Calumet phase. The first phase was a few thousand years before that. And then, of course, I've always wondered what it'd be like to be standing on the shores of Lake Michigan and know that I still had another 50 to 100 miles to get to Lake Michigan. That would be interesting to find out what was all there. And then finally, the final stage that caused Lake Michigan to slowly settle to where it is today about 1,000 years ago was the Nipissing phase. So they left a lake plain, which again, Shellburg Farm sits on that. And then of course, to the south, we've got the morainal section, and we've got a little bit of the Grand Prairie, most of which we're just outside the eastern edge of that. This is the pre-settlement vegetation. And if you look where Shellburg Farm is to the right, over in this area here, it's probably most likely wooded communities. Could have been a little bit of wetland there because the river is so close. But another diagram I found that kind of showed the locations of the different beaches and so forth, and what it might have looked like before settlement again. And then after the Native Americans got involved, you can kind of see where some of their settlements were, some of their villages. But most importantly, in the early 1800s, Joseph Bailey settled at the intersection of the North Branch of the Sauk Trail and the Calumet Beach Trail. Of course, it helped that the little Calumet River was pretty close too. So Bailey Homestead, again, 1824 was Joseph Bailey shows up as far as the history goes in sometime in the War of 1812. He was actually working for the British at the time, was arrested by the Americans and let go after a few months, and then finally became an American citizen once we became a country in 1818. And again, 1824 was when he finally settled on this location and started the actual Bailey trading post. After the fur trade fizzled, they started getting into logging. Joel Wicker, the son-in-law of Joseph Bailey, was involved in that. In the 1840s, of course, they needed a lot of lumber for the railroads. 1870s, they needed a lot of lumber to help rebuild Chicago. But in the meantime, he also hired some immigrant labor. And this, of course, brings us to the Shellberg family. The original frame house that they had burned in 1884. We'll get into some more detail here. But this is actually one of the slides from our Logs to Lustrons tour. So we've got some things there from 1875 and then a few things from 1940 also. But basically the entire, all the structures are restored to about 1905, somewhere between 1900 and 1905. So just a quick history of the family itself. They immigrated from Sweden in 1863. In 1869 was when they purchased the land from the Bailey family, 40 acres, and then they purchased another 40 acres a few years later. By 1872, they had their first wooden house built. They had an outhouse. They were well-to-do, so it was a two-seater. And they also had a well dug and a barn. They also had, in 1879, a wagon shed, chicken house, and a corn crib, the first rendition of the corn crib. The farm, so this is how they used the land back then, included 1 acre apple orchard with about 23 trees, 40 acres of tilled land, 10 acres of woodland, 10 acres of unimproved. The tilled land was a mixture of hay, Indian corn, oats, rye, wheat, potatoes, and we still haven't been able to determine what the other 14 acres were. In 1885, they built a new house because in 1884, the wood frame house burned down. And then in 1890, they built the granary. Oh, shoot. See if I can get to this. Need to go back one here. Sorry about that. Just if you've been to Shellberg and you want to, you've seen how dense the forests are. Take a look at the size of the trees, and that'll kind of give you an idea that it was not very old. And this picture here is what you're kind of looking at not too long after things were logged out. So it looked like the only trees that were still standing were mostly the ones that they could tap. So that things have changed a lot since that picture. Again, just a kind of an old picture from early part of the 20th century, Shellberg Farm. This is kind of what the house started looked like after we started doing some renovations on it in the 1970s. I believe we had the Shellberg farmhouse, Shellberg buildings, and the Bailey homestead was, they were all renovated in time for the bicentennial back in 1976. So in 1901, the farmhouse expanded and was renovated again when the parents had a hard time getting upstairs, or possibly for other reasons. They decided to take one of the kitchen that was in the house and turn it into a bedroom, and then add on the kitchen that's there today. 1906, they upgraded their windmill by putting an areometer, a specific brand that was pretty popular at the time. In 1908, they started their dairy operations. So a lot of people don't realize that there used to be a silo on the west side of the barn there. Especially, it was a good thing to get into because they now had a ready source of transportation into Chicago with the South Shore. Pole barn was built in the early 1900s. 1917, the silo was built. They finally got electricity at the farm in 1919. If you've ever done our maple sugar programs, like the ones we're going to be having pretty soon in March, you probably have heard a number of times that the sugar shack was built in 1934 to 35 by Carl Shellberg and Alden Studebaker. So they were using some other types of processing of the sap if they were doing it any time before that. But this is an earlier picture of the sugar shack. Threshing occurs for the last time in 1938. They tore the silo down in 1940. My understanding is they needed some wood to rebuild the silo because they found a truck kind of buried in the silo My only thinking is that somebody might have done something with the corn in there that could have caused them to drive the truck into the silo. But that's another story. Truck garden farming in 1943 to 45. They finally got indoor plumbing. 1958. This is kind of goes along with a lot with what we're talking about. Agriculture is no longer the primary family business. By the late 60s, the family was planning on making subdividing the property, making a subdivision. And then finally in 1972, the farm was acquired from the family by the US government, and it became part of the National Lakeshore. And that's kind of what it looked like when we got it in 1972. So Dorothy Buell is in the picture on the left. She's kind of responsible for helping get the Save the Dunes started, and our first park superintendent, James Whitehouse, over by our first park headquarters, which is now the USGS building. And this is some of the things we had to deal with as far as rebuilding or renovating the barn. So what I did here was, this is in our one of our reports, and just kind of show you the growth of the farm itself. And this is the 1869 to 1884. There's an original wood farmhouse and a barn, a chicken house, and a well, and that's it. Just a nice picture of the some oats stacked in our field. In 1885 to 1893, we've got the granary has been an addition. So things are starting to grow. It looks like unfortunately the printing here is small, so I'll just hit the highlights. But again, I mainly just did this to kind of show you how the farm grew. The actual garden was a little bit further to the west, and most likely did not have a fence around it like we have around the garden today. From 1893 to 1908, there are some further additions, including a vineyard over here, a smokehouse, a woodshed. So we've got some things starting to pop up there. 1908 to 1937, here you got the sugar camp finally coming in here. Notice right here, there's also a tenant house. That was, I saw the remains or the ruins of that when I started working at the park in 1984. And that was disassembled very quickly after that. There's our former farmer Jim Smitty doing a little bit of field preparation, possibly planting. Okay, 1938 to 1972. Probably adding just a few of the more modern conveniences on the farm at this time. And hopefully putting in some native flowers in the round garden right out front in front of the house. And so this is the way it looks basically today. We are using this as a parking area here, but the historic core, especially around the buildings, we still tried to respect and honor the 85 to 1905 time period, because it used to be the whole farm was under that heading, and then we again focus on the buildings, trying to keep them in the historic time period, but the rest of the farm, the themes now are this is where your food comes from, and this is how we try to do it sustainably. We've had some people say that this is a very significant farm, and a lot of people come in and say that this is just a normal farm that you would have found in Northwest Indiana, and they just happen to have be run by folks from Sweden, immigrants from Sweden. So again, I wanted to kind of focus on this. As far as the big picture goes, this is what the pre-settlement vegetation looked like back then. And if you've seen the Chicago Wilderness magazine that came out several years ago, you notice that they also have a very nice picture that shows you what it looks like today. So a lot of the color is now gone, and a lot of the a lot of the at least the natural areas that are being managed are either under federal management, state, county, and then privately owned, like a lot of the parcels in the Shirley Heinze Land Trust and other organizations like that. So our current stewardship manager, volunteer manager, stewardship coordinator is Jim, excuse me, Jim Whiteneck. And basically we had some teaching to do. We had to kind of learn ourselves exactly what we meant by sustainability. So sustainable agriculture, when you're looking at profit, making sure that you're trying to make money, at least on the average over the long term. Stewardship of our land, air, and water. Farmers have always kind of been looked at as the stewards of the land, but and then the quality of life for farmers and the folks in and around their communities. So more specifically, sustainability at Shellburg, when we're talking about marketing. Oops, just lost my screen, sorry. When you're looking at marketing, we are starting to brand some of the products that we have there. We sold Shellburg Farm syrup in the past couple of years. We'll probably never have enough chickens to do eggs, but watch for beef coming pretty soon. We're trying to optimize animal welfare. We've gone from the park owning all the animals to making a farm that is available for people who want to raise animals. All the animals at Shellburg Farm are owned by somebody else and taken care of by somebody else with the help of the national park, employees at the national park. So for example, there's a family that has a few steers there. We provide free access and free housing. And then the park gets much more push to our, when the visitor comes, they have a little bit more of a realistic experience of being on a farm. As far as crop health and protection, we're doing soil sampling and trying to make sure that we can enhance the plant diversity, and then at the same time, we'll be increasing the biodiversity at the farm also. We're trying to use native plants as much as possible. Pastures management, for example, we now have the two main pastures that we have that we're going to be doing some haying from. All of the plants all the seeds that we planted there were from native plants a couple of years ago. And hopefully next year we'll actually be able to get our first cutting off of that. We're looking at conservation and tillage and soil health. Again, soil testing. There's very little tillage going on, possibly just scraping the top of the soil. We don't rototill the garden anymore. We're not going to be plowing up the fields. If anything, we'll just do like a chisel plow where there's just a little notch cut into the ground with the seeds dropped in there. Compost and manure are being used for fertilizers instead of any inorganic purchased fertilizers. So we're managing the nutrients that way. Utilizing energy-saving devices whenever possible in the buildings, in and around the buildings, trying to prevent some pollution control. Landscapes and nature conservation. We're trying to connect the farm as much as possible to the natural environment, trying to make the hedgerows look more natural. If needed, anywhere near any water, would try to make sure that there's green belts to help block and catch any runoff. We're trying to start feathering the edges between, instead of having like the ground and then a flat, and then the ground goes right up to the woods and then you have the trees. We're trying to make sure that there's a kind of a feathered edge there. So there's trees and there's shrubs, and then there's some taller plants, and then you get to the what's growing in the field. And then finally, climate resilience, trying to manage the risks associated with any type of changing climates. We don't have a big deal with that out there like they might have in Miller Woods, trying to find the right type of a lupin that's on the right schedule with the Carter blue butterfly, for example. So at any rate, that's what's going on at Shellburg Farm, and that's a little bit of the history there. And I will go ahead and pass it back to you, Alicia.
Great, thank you, Bill. Really appreciate that presentation, and I'm sure there's lots of questions. So as we said at the beginning, if you guys think of anything, feel free to put it in the chat, or we will have an opportunity at the end to have question answer as well. So Eric, do you want to do your presentation now?
Sure. So I'm Eric. I'm the Stewardship Director for Shirley Heinze Land Trust. So if I assume that most of you know who we are, but if you don't know who we are and what we do, we preserve land as nature preserves. And as Stewardship Director, I'm in charge of the program to take care of all those lands, do restoration and manage the trails. A lot of them are publicly accessible. Our mission is to, protect this land, but also engage people with nature. So a lot of our nature preserves are open to the public. There's a little bit over 2,800 acres protected now. We're getting to the 3,000 mark. There's about 30 different nature preserves across 6 different counties, and 6 of them are state dedicated nature preserves. So we're very proud of that. We are an accredited land trust, which means that we've worked really hard in our business practices and everything that we do to be honest and trustworthy and sound financial practices so that we can take care of these properties forever. Our job is perpetual and forever. So if you haven't seen Shirley Heinze Land Trust, check us out at heinzetrust.com and, heinzetrust.org. Or on our Facebook and Instagram and things like that. Find a nature preserve near you to get out and look at. Today, I'm going to be talking about Meadowbrook Nature Preserve. So that's where our home office is. It's in Valparaiso, an unincorporated northern part of Valparaiso. Our Meadowbrook Nature Preserve has a rich and long history. And I just want to bring that to the forefront. The theme throughout these presentations is that these places used to be agriculture, right? They were farms, and now they're an important part of our community. So Meadowbrook Nature Preserve is this orange and red block right here in the middle, and it's along the Valparaiso Moraine. So Bill sort of mentioned the glaciers came and they pushed and left a lot of rocks and sediment, which made a higher elevation, a hilly area called the Valparaiso Moraine. Sort of skirts the southern coast of Lake Michigan a few miles down. In Valparaiso, it's one of the highest points, so we're about 600, 700 feet above sea level. So when you're driving from the south to the north up to the beach, you start going over some hills and you start seeing some forests, and that's part of the moraine. So when you're on like Ridge Road or Route 6 right there in Valparaiso is kind of way up on top of the moraine, and you can see very far from there. So we're stuck right there in the middle, and this white dotted line represents a power line right of way that sort of connects all these other protected lands, which includes right next to us is Sunset Hill Farm Park. So that is a Porter County park. It was a farm in the early 1930s. The Murray family ran that farm. It was a lot of chickens, eggs, and dairy cows. It grew to over 200 acres, and when the colonel passed away in the 70s, they had donated that to Porter County Parks, and they still keep that history going as a farm. So you can go there and you can see they have like the steam engine events where they have steam powered tractors and things like that. They're still doing farming out there, even with the prairies and conservation and all of those kinds of things. And it's got this very farm-like atmosphere. So you can go learn about how the farms operate. And it's a great part of our natural history in Indiana. And then just down from that is Moraine Nature Preserve, and sort of the core of that preserve was donated by a family as well. I believe it was originally farmland, but when they owned it, it was like a nursery. So they sold like trees and shrubs and plants and things like that. But they donated that to the state of Indiana, and it has grown so much, and also includes some agricultural land. But I'm going to talk a little bit today about Meadowbrook. So we're right there in the middle, and we're just about 300 acres now, which is really impressive. And I'm going to kind of talk about how that started. So originally it was the Snook family farm. It was called Triple Creek Farm. And they probably owned most of the entire block there. between like Campbell and 149, and sold off pieces of that over time, right? So farms used to be really, really big, and they would get parceled off to be smaller farms, and then houses and things like that. But the Snook family, this is an older picture, and you can sort of see the silo up here poking up over the maple trees. And there's a little cluster of trees over here to the right that I believe looks to me to be like an orchard. And I believe there's still some of those apple trees are sitting in the backyard of our office. But the silo is the only building that remains on the site. All of the other buildings have long since been torn down. Long time ago, they were, dilapidated and falling apart and things like that. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But yeah, if you come to Meadowbrook and you come to visit, you can still see that silo, and we hope to, fancy it up a little bit as we go on. But the Snook Family Farm silo still stands there. It's strong. Those things never fall down. In the 60s, 1963, I believe. The Snook family sold about 79 acres of the farm to the Drifting Dunes Girl Scout Council. So it became a Girl Scout camp, and a lot of people that visit Meadowbrook still have this attachment to Meadowbrook as a Girl Scout camp. It was for many years, from 1963, it was retired in 2011. So you can imagine that literally generations went to the same camp and had great outdoor experiences. The girls did things like started planting trees in different areas. So we owe a lot of the first reforestation to the Girl Scouts. And just like I said, like a lot of people have a very reminiscent connection to the property. So we bought the property, Shirley Heinze. Well, I guess I wanted to show these old aerial photos. So the one on the left is from 1958, and you can see this block of woods right here that goes along the ravine. And then there's a couple other blocks of woods that are really remnant. So those blocks have been there for more than 50, 60 years at least, right? So that is what we call like our old growth woods at Meadowbrook. And to the right is 1973. And you can see that same block of woods along the ravine and these ones out here in this weird L-shaped field. But you can also see this road that goes back here, and it goes to the Girl Scout cabin. So this is after it's a Girl Scout camp already. So the road goes to the cabins, and then there was an archery range out here, but you could still see that quite a bit of the fields are still rather open, just these older blocks of woods. This is what it looks like now. You can still see this L-shaped part of the field here and these older blocks of woods, and this is the block along the ravine. But a lot of trees have grown in, especially in the Girl Scout camp area. So some of that may be due to them planting trees, and some of it may just be due to them, not mowing or doing agriculture anymore. And you can still see the road going back there that goes back to the cabins of the Girl Scout camp. Shirley Heinze purchased the Girl Scout unit in 2013. It has a house and a barn, some buildings on it. It's still got the old cabins on it. And when we purchased it, it was in some pretty rough shape. So volunteers, staff came in day after day, painting, spackling, mudding, ripping out an old kitchen, putting in a new bathroom floor. Just a lot of renovations went into this place for some time, for a good part of a year. And as they're driving out there and going back and forth, they also notice that there's another farm next door that's for sale, another 80 acres right next door to it. So this was a big deal for Shirley Heinze, a big movement into a large new office. We had our own house, our own office. It really helped grow the organization. And when there's 80 acres for sale next to the 75 acres you already own, and you're a nature land trust, you try to purchase that. So they did, and they worked with the Dieters family to purchase the Dieters family farm, which was right next door. And the Dieters family had already put the farm into the Conservation Reserve Program. So that's a program through the USDA that pays you rental fees to take land out of production and put it into, you know, a natural state. So they had a lot of wildflowers and things planted out there. I believe it was in the CRP program since about the 80s. So when we purchased it, a lot of that had already been kind of restored and already had some wildflowers and things like that out there. Really beautiful land. But our goal on the Valparaiso Moraine, when you look at that big old picture, or that big picture of the whole conservation area, is to reforest it. The Valparaiso Moraine should be big blocks of forest, and that's really important for a lot of species, especially forest-dependent birds. So when we purchased the Girl Scout camp, we started planting some trees where there were some gaps and things like that, probably about 2,000 trees. When we purchased the Dieters farm, we went on one of the biggest reforestation projects we've ever taken on. So through 2015 through about, it finished in about 2016, we planted about 35,000 trees out in the open field areas. We used contractors. They have a tractor here and it's got a little tree planter on the back and just kind of puts a little crease into the ground. We plug native trees in there, all the same kind of trees that you would see in the moraine forest. Like I said, the goal is to make big blocks of wood. So if you go out there now, those trees are already poking up over the grass and you can see little spotted trees all over the field. We're very proud of that. That was a huge project. At the same time, we planted about 11,000 trees over at Moraine Nature Preserve, where they also had an open field area. So it was a big, big reforestation project, took a lot of time, a lot of money. It was a huge project for Northwest Indiana even. In about 2016, this field up here, a farm owned by the Gloyeski family, Jerry Gloyeski, was for sale. And we worked really hard with Jerry and purchased this land. Jerry has since passed away. He was a really nice guy. He really worked with us to help us get this property. The one right next to us is sort of slated for development, and we didn't want to see that happen in this other area. And this might have been, in Shirley Heinze's Land Trust history, we've purchased properties that had some woods and they maybe have like a little bit of farm field on them. And we'll just, you know, make pollinator habitat or plant trees or something like that. But this was probably the first big farm purchase where it was all tillable agricultural land. And what did we do? We went and planted more trees. So we planted about 14,000 trees out here in these fields. So the Dieters parcel got done first. That was done in about 2016, and the Gloyeski parcel got done in about 2017, 2018. So it's just a couple of years behind. When we did that, a farmer came to us one day and said, "What'd you do to that property? I used to farm that property and you're letting it all go to weeds and stuff." And we said, "Well, no, we're planting trees. It's not all weeds, I promise, right? It'll look beautiful one day, right?" And sort of became friends with him, sort of realized, hey, he's kind of right? We bought this 80-acre farm and we turned it into trees right away without even thinking twice about it. And if we're going to buy these bigger properties that are going to be farmland, maybe we should decide what we're going to do with it. And so as we bought the next field up here that goes all the way up to 6 and takes Meadowbrook up to 300 acres, we decided to work with that same farmer, Tom Murphy. He's the Conservation Farmer of the Year for Porter County Soil and Water Conservation District. We're going to work with him to farm this land and keep it in agriculture and do best management practices. So there's some plans to do grassed waterways where there's erosion happening because, again, you're on the Valparaiso Moraine. It's very hilly and a lot of water sort of seeps out of the ground in different places. Going to try to do cover crops and no-till and good nutrient management and all those things. So there's a wetland up in the corner we'll do some restoration on, but most of this will stay in farming. And the purpose of that will be to show people these really great practices that they can do. So we have a farm next to a forest that is a nature preserve that people are allowed to come on and learn about things, right? So it's a big step in Shirley Heinze's history to work on in agricultural protection and to keep things to be a working farm. That's not the usual for land trust. We started doing some master planning and thinking about how to make Meadowbrook more of a destination spot, more accessible for more people. We wanted to have some areas that were permeable pavement and gravel trails so that people that have trouble walking on the rough trails or walking up the stairs and things like that could come enjoy a shorter nature trail and make a gathering space for people. And we did complete that just last year in 2022. We completed phase 1. So these are permeable pavers. We have some retention pond areas that are planted naturally. This is a large outdoor pavilion that gives us space for programming and a bathroom unit outside for people that are coming to walk the trails. There's about 4 miles of trails at Meadowbrook, maybe a little bit more now, and there will be more in the future as we make some trails that go out to the actual farm all the way up there on 6. Our goal is to make this place a conservation destination, a real, institution within Northern Valparaiso that people can come and learn about the environment. So we do programming, we take people on guided hikes, we talk about tree identification, and we talk about the animals and birds that you'll see out there. And just really, we want to create a culture of conservation where people care about these things, know about these things, and understand the work that we're doing. So we've always done that. Like I said, we have several nature preserves, but Meadowbrook allowed us to have a home base with some really great facilities and some really great parking so that we can have more, larger crowds of folks and do some really good programming. The pavilion's already been filled for different events, different program events. People can use it free of charge to, have a Boy Scout meeting or a Girl Scout meeting there, or other sort of partners might use it for a meeting or some programming events. We've done some water quality events. We've done some agricultural field day events out in the pavilion already. So we're really proud of this space, and we're really excited to use this space over the next couple of years. We do a lot of programming, like I said, a lot of volunteer work. So trees, plants, all the invasive species, all the things that we do, boardwalks, stairs, things like that, are really done with volunteers. And again, getting out there and getting dirty, having this accessible area that you can come and work and learn about the environment, really helps instill a culture of conservation in the area that we live. A lot of students come out and use Meadowbrook. These are some students doing some water quality monitoring. I believe they're Valparaiso University students. Some students use our nature preserves. They do their thesis work, or they do some environmental research project on insects or snakes or fish or whatever it may be. So we always encourage college students and things, internships, to learn about the environment and encourage them to go into fields that will take care of the environment in the future. We did have an agricultural field day. That's Tom Murphy, our exceptional farmer, showing people where we're going to do some grassed waterways out on the farm that we just purchased all the way up there by 6, the Schroeder family farm. So what I really want to drive home with this is that Meadowbrook, Sunset Hill Farm, Chalberg Farm, these were all farmlands that were somehow preserved in a very unique way, right? And even though they're not still working farms, they've become a big part of people's lives and their experiences with nature. So just a way to think about protecting your land, whether it be forest or farmland, in a different kind of way, right? So maybe the family doesn't take over the farming operations. Maybe it's not going to be a farm anymore. But this Sunset Hill, Chalberg, still lives on as a legacy for people to come and learn about the environment, learn about the agricultural history, learn about our natural history, and can just serve as a place for learning and education and nature enjoyment for years and years. So this is the aerial photo now, and you can still see that snook silo standing there with all these new things, including this gravel trail that's much more accessible. If you haven't come out to Meadowbrook, I encourage you to come see it sometime. Come in the spring, you'll see beautiful spring wildflowers. I'm happy to stick around and answer questions, but if you need to, this is my email address, ebird@heinzetrust.org. And if you're interested in farm preservation, you can email us at farms@heinzetrust.org and see more on our website and things like that. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Eric. And we do have Jake from Porter County Parks who's on. So if you want to hop in and tell us a little bit more about Sunset Hill.
Alrighty, so this is a kind of a brief overview of a presentation of the history of Sunset Hill Farms, kind of how it started, how it came to be, and then towards the end, a little direction on how we're currently maintaining it, and then some of our future plans as well. So Sunset Hill Farms started with Colonel Robert Murray. He was born in October 18th of 1881. In his early life, he was recognized as an incredible and dedicated student, which will later serve him well in his agricultural and business pursuits. He actually won the Daily News Award in 8th grade from the Alice Bernard School, and then studied chemistry at Lewis Institute. He then studied at the University of Chicago, where Dr. Steiglitz, a professor of chemistry, noted him to be a most excellent and diligent student, and he was a pleasure to work with. That'll also be something that kind of gets resounded over and over again throughout his life, as being somebody who was a pleasure to work with and brilliant to be around. After graduating from the University of Chicago, he was offered a graduate scholarship, but he passed it up in order to start his life with Sue Murray, who he married in November of 1905. Sue Murray was his first wife. In his early business career, he was highly successful. He actually received a commission as captain in the U.S. Army Reserves in 1917. He was then pretty quickly promoted to major and then to lieutenant colonel when he was in command of the 311th and the 21st Engineer Regiments. In 1920, he was elected to the American Society of Civil Engineers. And then after that, he founded the Neumod Hosier Company that produced women's stockings in 1926. His company was highly successful, even through the Great Depression, which hit just a few years later. And by 1933, his company was operating out of 56 storefronts, of which it required him to travel to Chicago several times a week. So he would travel from the land in Sunset to Chicago to operate the business. And then he remained president of the company until just before his death in 1972. Then the start of Sunset Hill Farm. In 1934, he purchased the original 80 acres in Liberty Township, and that was the start of Sunset Hill Farm. So that particular spot was the original location in Liberty Township. Originally, he liked the idea that his house was built on an unassuming hill, when in actuality it is the North American Divide, mentioned in the previous presentation, a pretty significant ecological area. Land creates a natural divide that feeds water on one side to the Atlantic via the St. Lawrence Basin, and on the other side the Gulf via the Illinois, Mississippi, and Kankakee rivers. In 1961, Colonel Murray and Lloyd Prosser, who was the farm manager at the time, made a partnership contract due to Murray believing that the profits from the business should be shared with the man who was doing a great deal of work, whereas the farmhands did a lot of the manual labor, and he believed it was important that the profits from that work be shared among them. So his first wife, Sue, passed away in 1962, where he then married Elizabeth Murray, a former Chicago School Board member, in 1964. Colonel Murray passed away due to cancer complications on October 28th in 1972, and his ashes were buried in Murray Woods on the east side of what is now Sunset Hill Farm County Park. Other than that farmhouse, you can see there is still actually out there. So the early beginnings, between 1935 and 1937, the first barn was built. Originally, the land was not well suited for a farm. It was very swampy, very unruly, but the swamps were filled in with land dredge to make new ponds, and the roads were cut through the hills on the property. Between 1935 and 1954, over 155 additional acres were purchased, which brought the property to the total of 235 acres of land, which it is currently now at still. This was an early example of regenerative farming. The land was said to be so poor that it couldn't sustain even a rabbit. So in order to introduce the necessary nutrients and stability into the soil, crop rotations were implemented. So different crops, different seasons, different years, in order to provide the necessary nutrients back into the soil. And then the land was then later used to grow feed to feed the cows, which became their mainstay shortly after. On the east side of the property, the Murray Woods was planted, which consisted of over 30,000 hand-planted pines to prevent erosion on the sandy hills. In the early years, Pete Hanrahan was hired as the first farm manager. Along with the Guernsey cows that the farm was known for at the time, the barn held 2 horses, over 100 sheep, and 1,200 chickens. In the beginning, most of the sales made on the farm were from eggs and chicken meat. It wasn't until Murray recognized the demand for raw milk in a time when it was becoming less common that he then transitioned it into a dairy farm and more of a milking operation as opposed to the sheep and chickens. In 1946, Murray decided that the Guernsey cows, the ones he was primarily raising at the time, were not the right breed for those goals. So at that point, he switched breeds and began conducting milking experiments, which is where his skills as a student and a dedicated note taker became prominent. So the milking process was quite labor intensive. The farm hands would arrive to work at 4:30 a.m. and then one worker would bring the cow in from the pasture or the loafing bar and secure them while another worker prepared the milking equipment. This included cleaning the pipes and adding the strainer to the line to remove any dirt to make sure the process was sanitary and that the milk was clean and the cows were clean. Supplements were fed to the cow along with feed to distract it during the process so they didn't get out of hand. 5 cows could be milked at one time. Each cow was cleaned off with warm water from a nozzle spray. This also encouraged the cows to let down the milk. And then milking took about 5 minutes per cow, and between 80 to 90 cows were milked 2 times a day. Proper cleaning and pasteurization, once that was required, and bottling would all take place all before the farm hands ate breakfast. So this was done first thing in the morning prior to anything else happening on the farm. And then this was repeated again at 4:30 p.m. Every afternoon as well. So the milking experiments, Colonel Murray was meticulous for his record keeping and his note taking. So he meticulously kept the records and recorded all the milk and butter fat production from each cow. He did this to help his production to figure out what led to better production and what didn't, but also with the hopes that the information would be useful to students of agriculture as well as of the dairy farms. Keeping notes for students of agriculture became very prominent, as that was part of what he was intending to do originally as well, was to either leave the land to Purdue or the county, either for education or conservation. And these measures also informed the breeding choices he made and the feed choices as well. His main goal in his experiments was to produce high quality milk and to produce the best feed to reach that goal. He worked with Purdue University, regularly checking his ideas with professors and professionals in the field. And he also corresponded frequently with the U.S. Department of Agriculture on his findings. His methods were shared at a Liberty Township Farm Bureau meeting in a paper that he actually titled More Cans of Milk in October of 1950. In a letter he wrote to the director of the Purdue Dairy Program on the 6th of January, 1961, he said, "In 1946, I came to the conclusion that the Guernseys were not suitable for my program, which was to produce essential human food at minimum cost to the consumer with an acceptable standard of living for the dairyman." He continued that he was not interested in fancy breeding stock to be sold at inflated prices to unsuspecting, hardworking dairymen. So he was very passionate about keeping it affordable and providing the necessary nutrients and services to the people and his help. The hands that built the farm. The first farm manager that was hired initially after the first 80 acres was purchased was Pete Hanrahan. He was 26 when he was hired in 1935. He said he was hired immediately after the first 80 acres were purchased to start that work. He actually grew up on his parents' farm that was adjacent to the newly purchased land. And part of Colonel Murray's employment, or how they ran the farm, is that the farmhands would live on property. So they were all provided housing and supplies. So he lived on the farm in the house that is now known as the farmhouse, which is one of our main houses there on site that we're currently doing some work to now for restoration. He died at around 6:15 in the morning on December 3rd, 1952, in the main barn from a heart attack when he was only 44. The Prossers, Lloyd and Ethel Prosser, were originally hired to work on the farm in 1937. Lloyd was made the farm manager after Pete's death. And then in 1961, Colonel Murray and Lloyd Prosser made the partnership where that the profits would be shared between the farm manager and Colonel Murray. So caring for the community at large, Colonel Murray and Sue Murray both were known for their community service and almost philanthropic type work. Colonel Murray was known to visit all the tenant homes, which were provided by the Murrays for the farmhands for free. The homes that had children every Christmas to see them on Christmas morning, to check in with them and see how, I guess, the joy that they got in the presents when they opened them up on Christmas morning. He ensured that each farmhand that lived in the property received a home, a good salary, as well as milk and eggs from the farm. He actually built a bobsled with the steering wheel for the kids to slide on, and cleared out a small area of trees to make that happen. He gifted nylons from his company for Christmas every year. Then he considered those who worked on the farm his family. Actually, at his first wife's funeral, he declined to sit in the chair set up front in favor of sitting with the adjacent room for the farmhands. And according to an interview later on in 1997 with the Prossers, he said that he would rather sit with the family. So he did view the people that worked with him on the farm as more than just workers. They were family to him. And then Sue Murray, despite her often seeming rigid exterior, she was known to be extremely generous and go out of her way for someone in need. Her chauffeur remembered stopping numerous times on outings for her to scold children who were not treating their pets very well. The Prossers, the farm managers and partial owners, also claimed that part of why their sheep were removed from the farm was owing to the fact that she couldn't stand to hear the bleating of the ewes when their lambs were taken from them. So she had a very, very warm heart. Lloyd Prosser was often sent with baskets of food to people in need by the instruction of Mrs. Murray. And then after the birth of Prosser's daughter, Janet, in 1941, Mrs. Murray insisted that the house was too small and unfit to raise a child, so she had a new house built for them to accommodate the growing family. And that's the one they stayed in up until 1942. Farm to park. At one point, milk was no longer sold on the farm. They stopped selling about 1967. Dixie Dairy was the sole customer of Sunset Hill until shortly before Colonel Murray's death. Upon his death, it was Colonel Murray's wish that the land either be given to Purdue for educational space or to Porter County for recreational space. His second wife, Elizabeth, was largely responsible for making his wish a reality. And on July 26, 1983, the original Porter County Parks Department of Parks and Recreation was created to complete that project, to put it into the county for recreation, making Sunset Hill Farm the first Porter County park. The original goal of the park was to preserve as much historical background and land use as possible, while providing suitable recreational space for future generations. So some current education that goes on to help retain that is the NIPA, the Northwest Indiana Historical Power Association. They've actually got a few buildings out there that they lease from us, where they store agricultural equipment, and they actually do farm a good chunk of the land out there. They actively do farm it and provide educational programming on that, as well as put on the Harvest Festival, which showcases the historical farming techniques and the machinery. And then we've also got some programming, a lot of programming that we do. We've got Farm Hands and Meet the Animal programs, which is to educate children on animal husbandry and sustainable gardening. And then field trips, where we educating children on native species, environmental sustainability, and farm animal care and use. And then one of our fastest growing things that we have right now is our summer camp. And the summer camp focuses on adventure education, which includes education on gardening, environmental sustainability, animal husbandry, archery, and many other topics. Some future projects at the park that we've got going on right now, we're actively in pursuit of replacing a playground out there that has begun to become dilapidated. We plan to replace that either in the fall of this year or very early of next year. Updating our website containing the history of Sunset Hill Farm and Brink Across. That way we can share it with more people. And then we're actively in the process of actually adding another 3 to 5 acre of native wildflower prairie restoration plot, which I look to start in the spring. That's all I got.
Great. Thank you so much, Jake, for your presentation. So as Eric mentioned, really the theme of this presentation and all the different stories that you heard tonight is preserving farmland legacy in unique ways. And as you can see from these stories, all of the properties are really providing education and public benefit and examples of agricultural best practices and sustainability that really preserve the legacy of these families and the farms that once existed on the land. So I do want to mention, just to build off of what Eric had said at the end of his presentation, Shirley Heinze Land Trust has started an agricultural land program, and as Eric said, we have a web page. It's heinzetrust.org/farms, and we have an email, farms@heinzetrust.org. That if you want more information or are looking for some of the programs that were mentioned today, you can reach out to us to set up a time to talk with us, or get together with us on your land to talk about that as well. These are just some of the things that our program focuses on, including preserving farmland, wetland mitigation, water quality monitoring, and doing education and outreach like this talk tonight, so that people can learn more about best management practices and conservation. So, like we said, if you have any questions, want to set up a time to talk with us, definitely reach out and send us an email or give us a call. So thank you. That concludes our presentation. A few quick things before we get into the questions. We do have a survey that we would like everyone to fill out. I will put it in the chat in a second, and also send it to you in the email. This helps us to track how successful our events are and support future funding for our work. This particular webinar was made possible by a grant that we received from the National Wildlife Federation Conservation Champions. So please fill out the survey and help us in that way. And also be sure to follow all 3 of the different organizations on social media, so that you can keep up to date on future events that might be of interest and future improvements that might be coming to these different properties. Okay, so I'm sure there's a lot of questions that people have. So if you have questions, feel free to use the raise hand function in Zoom, or put them in the chat. And we will make sure that we can get them answered by the different presenters.
Also, just if you have a farm yourself that you're preserving or that's come down through your family, we'd love to hear your stories as well. And if you don't feel comfortable talking on the Zoom or something, feel free to email us and let us know what you're up to, because we love those kinds of stories as well.
So Eric, there's a question in the chat that says, does Eric do guided walks to explain some of this at Meadowbrook?
So we do quite a bit of different programs and guided hikes, and sometimes it's me or it's Mari or Alicia. Somebody gives a guided hike. If you have like a group or something you would like to do that with, you're welcome to try to schedule something like that with us, and we're happy to help make that happen. But if you just check out our webpage and different events coming up, a lot of events happen at Meadowbrook because it is that conservation destination and it's easy to get to. Mari, do we have anything coming up particular? I know somebody told me we have an April hike, right? Coming up.
Yeah. So we're trying to offer programs on a regular basis, every month at Meadowbrook, starting this year. Nothing particularly ag focused, although that's really good feedback to hear that people do want to hear about that. So something we can definitely incorporate in future hikes, and maybe I'll collaborate with Alicia and Eric on that. But we do have a Pi Day hike coming up next month, which is of course on March 14th, and then also an April Fool's hike, which is happening. That's no joke. Yeah, again, we love hearing feedback on what people want to hear about Meadowbrook because there are so many different types of ecosystems, so many types of projects going on. So if people want to hear more about ag, that's good to know.
And if you
Yeah.
visit Meadowbrook, the house is our office. So walk inside, ask questions. We have materials we can give you, things like that. So if you can catch me indoors, I'm happy to talk to you.
And I was just going to say there definitely will be more programming coming as Eric mentioned. We just are working with our farmer partner Tom on that new property. So once we kind of get that up and running, there'll be more opportunities too. So definitely keep your eye out for that.
Carol said she'd prefer meeting outdoors at Meadowbrook. Well, I come outdoors as well. Yeah, you can catch me in the parking lot too, or you could just say, hey, let's go walk.
And that's another great point too. Eric was talking about the capital improvements on the pavilion that's out there. So the pavilion is open. All of our preserves are open year round, but places like the pavilion and the trails are there. If you want to have a meeting out there, if you want to bring like your club or school group or your friends and have a picnic. So that's kind of available just all year round.
Great. Thanks for the great question, Carol. Any other questions for our speakers tonight? Okay, there's a question that came up that says, how similar or different are the crops and or livestock kept at these parks from the varieties previously kept at the farms?
Okay, yeah, like I said, for the most part, if you see the chickens, for example, the Shellbergs basically had dual purpose breeds. The breeds that we keep there most often are the Rhode Island Reds for chickens anyway. Rhode Island Red and Barred Rock. Occasionally someone gets rid of their chickens by sneaking over and throwing them in our chicken pen. So if you've seen the other chickens there, they weren't necessarily invited by us. They just sometimes show up once in a while. When they were dairying, they had a variety. I know they have a variety of different breeds, but I believe Christy, if you're listening, I'm pretty sure it was Brown Swiss, but there's I think 5 different breeds of cattle, and then they had some horses and cats. Yeah, the main thing. The only reason we had, and some people were asking questions about turkeys. The Shellbergs probably hunted the wild turkeys around the farm, but one of the last presentations, several years ago, they tried to, the park tried to farm the farm out, so to speak. They had some people apply to see if they could run the farm and live in the house across the street, the Nelson House. But then run the farm as a working farm and then let us do our programs, kind of like the Dunes Learning Center uses the camp, the old Goodfellow camp. And from that, it was approved. The plan was approved. The people weren't, but in the plan it included turkeys. So what we did was we went through and anybody who's interested in raising the animals there now, we just try to make sure that they pick from the lists of animals that were there, that were on the Shellberg farm or were approved to be there. And the most recent one, I think turkeys were the only ones that the Shellbergs actually didn't raise there. Hope that answered your question.
I might assume that they're getting to those better management practices, right? So we haven't really, we only just purchased the farmland this year. We're still closing on it, but we are working with Tom, and he has certainly done some different crops than just the corn and bean rotations. It's really more, and he wants to try some new things. We've talked about like doing some sunflowers and things like that, but it's really more a matter of how we're farming. So doing things like putting cover crops on, not turning the soil over as much, using less nutrients, less nutrient runoff. It's going to be more of those types of practices. our real goals are soil health and water quality, right? So we building soil health and organic matter in the soil through best management practices and preventing nutrients and different pollutants from going into the water systems and improving our water quality from that. So that might mean buffer strips or cover crops or erosion control. It might be no-till planting. I, though, am not the farmer. I have to work with Tom, and he is the expert, and we try things slowly and adapt new things as we go along. So it's a learning experience, and that's what a lot of farmers have to do. And for a lot of them, it's very risky, right? Because if you try something new and it fails, that's all your money for the year. So we start out slow, and we'll take those things piece by piece. Somebody had asked, who was Shirley Heinze? And I can answer that question. So Shirley Heinze was a professor at the University of Illinois in Chicago. She had a home in Ogden Dunes, and she helped a lot of children with like autism and different things on the spectrum in the very early days of like studying that. So some of her papers and work are about that. But she had this home in Ogden Dunes, and she loved the dunes, and she had a lot of these people that really loved her for helping with their family and things like that. She passed away, and Robert and Betty Lou Seidner started the Shirley Heinze Environmental Fund in her name for $30,000. So she was a woman that was smart, intelligent, touched a lot of people's lives, and then passed away kind of at an earlier age from cancer, and is just her friends just created this thing in her memory. So it still lives on today. We've evolved and grown from a $30,000 foundation to, you know, having 3,000 acres across 6 counties. There's some other questions popping up. Let's see, since the Guernseys were out, what breed did they jump to as more desirable? I think that's the Sunset Hill one, right?
Yeah, so we don't really have too much information on what breed of cow they switched to. Colonel Murray wasn't overly concerned about what breed they had. He was more concerned with which ones simply produced the best milk and the best butter. And then a lot of their agricultural practices and work at the time, once they switched to dairy farms away from kind of the meat production, most of their crop growing was done for the sole process of feeding the cows to try to maximize that production. So it was a very intertwined system where one thing was meant to help another thing, which then reverted back into another thing. So it was very much, the whole system was planned out around the one goal of producing the most milk and the most butter fat at the lowest possible cost to the consumer, while providing a good living for the people working on the farm. So he didn't really, that we know of, keep too much information on which specific breed of cows they started to purchase after the Guernsey cows, because it wasn't necessarily a priority on having the top shelf brand or whatever it was at the time. So I unfortunately don't actually know what breed of cow they switched to and had most commonly after the Guernseys went away.
Great. Thank you everyone again for joining us tonight. I'm going to put the survey one more time in the chat. So please, again, fill that out for us, and we'll send it out in an email as well. This webinar was recorded, so the recording will be available if you know of anyone who missed it that might be interested. And really feel free to reach out to any of us. All the emails are in the chat, and we can include those in our follow-up email as well, so that you have everyone's contact information in case you think of any questions or want to reach out about any of the programs. But thank you again for joining us. We appreciate you caring about conservation and joining us to learn about some of these neat stories that are right in our area. Have a great night.